Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back into a world that smells faintly of smoke, wet wool, and old wood. You've wandered into a medieval village just before dusk. The roofs are thatched, the pigs are loose, and people eye you sideways. Not because of what you're wearing, but because it's Tuesday. And worse, you look clean. A pair of muddy children run past you giggling, and you hear someone mutter behind a shuttered window, "Didn't anyone tell them what happened last time someone bathed on a Tuesday?" You chuckle, assuming it's just local gossip. But when you ask a man in the market square where the public bathhouse is, his expression changes from polite to pale. He leans in close and says, "Don't go near it today. Not after what happened to Martha." Then he just walks off. You're not entirely sure who Martha is, or what happened to her, but you start to notice that everyone else is unusually grimy. Hair clumped, nails black, and the smell, like pickled onions and damp blankets, lingers like a curse. You think back to what you've read. Bathhouses in the medieval period weren't just for getting clean, they were social spaces, kind of like a mix between a cafe, a spa, and a gossip hall. People met there to relax, share stew, and occasionally more private activities, so why ban them on one specific day? You find an old woman selling dried leeks, and when you ask her about the Tuesday rule, she laughs with a mouthful of gaps. Well, there's two reasons, she says. One practical, one less so. She tells you the practical reason first. The town only has one well and it's shallow. On Mondays, people clean everything, clothes, linens, themselves. The bathhouse fills up fast, the fires burn hot, and water usage spikes. If people bathe again on Tuesday, the town runs dry before Thursday, which is laundry day. So Tuesday became the official no-bathing buffer. You nod. That makes sense. Water was life in those days. Wells were temperamental, rivers were often polluted, and rain didn't always come when it should. Then she leans closer, lowers her voice, and says, "But the other reason? The murder." You raise an eyebrow. "Murder?" "Oh yes," she says. "Years ago, the apothecary's daughter, Martha, was found dead in the bathhouse. On a Tuesday. Water still warm. Candle still lit. No signs of struggle. Just gone. Folks say her ghost hates the smell of rosemary soap now." You're about to laugh, but then you notice there's a small bundle of dried rosemary hanging above the bathhouse door. And a charm. And salt. Whether it's for saving water or saving souls, you don't know. But no one here bathes on Tuesdays. Not anymore. You pass the bathhouse later, just as twilight fades. It's locked. The windows are fogged up, even though no one's inside. And for a moment you swear you see a flicker of movement behind the glass, like someone rising from water, hair heavy and dark. Probably just your imagination. Probably. You walk away a little quicker than before. The next morning you wake early, mostly because the town cockerel seems to have no snooze button, and decide to dig a little deeper. The bathhouse is still shut tight, its latch crusted with rust and rosemary sprigs freshly replaced. You follow your nose to the bakery instead, where a red-faced man kneads dough like it owes him money. He's covered in flour from elbow to eyebrow, and when you casually ask about the Tuesday bathing ban, he doesn't even look up. "Still on about that," he mutters. "Can't keep a secret in this town. You'd think Martha died last week." So it's not just old wives' tales then. The whole town treats the rule like holy writ. You press a bit more, and the baker eventually relents, giving you the real reason. Not the ghost story, not the water shortage, but something far more medieval. Plague. "It wasn't always about one girl," he says, slapping dough onto a board. "Back when the sweating sickness came through, folk noticed a strange thing. People who bathed too often, especially on consecutive days, got sicker, faster. Fever took 'em like a fox in a henhouse." He shrugs. "Of course we know now it wasn't the bathing, it was the steam. Closed windows, crowded rooms, one sick person in the bathhouse, and you might as well kiss your lungs goodbye." You blink. The ghost story had a certain eerie charm, but this is brutal epidemiology. It actually tracks with some historical understanding. While modern medicine didn't exist back then, medieval people weren't stupid. They observed patterns, and even if they misunderstood the cause, Miasmas, humours, planetary misalignment, they still notice correlations. Too many people bathing in one space, on the same days. Death followed. So they spaced it out. They gave the bathhouse a day to cool. A kind of medieval quarantine. As the baker shoves his dough into a roaring oven, he adds one last detail. Anyway, if you're really clean, folk assume you're either hiding something or French. Neither's a good look. You laugh, unsure if he's joking. But it hits you. Cleanliness wasn't always a virtue. In some medieval towns, public bathing was associated with sin, indulgence, even treason. To smell of rosewater in the wrong century was to invite suspicion, not admiration. You walk the streets a bit more, watching as townsfolk scrub benches, sweep doorsteps, even rake horse droppings into neat little piles. But no one washes themselves. Not until Wednesday. And as strange as it seems, it works. There's a kind of rhythm to it. Bathing becomes a ritual, a community event, something to look forward to, prepare for. Clothes get washed, pots are scrubbed. People light lavender or burn dried mint to mask the in-between stench. You remember the woman from the market square, her missing teeth, her voice like gravel, and the way she smiled as she told you. Some rules, child, were made by the living, others by the ones who never left. You decide, perhaps wisely, to wait until Wednesday for your own scrub, just in case Martha doesn't like the smell of modern shampoo. After all, in a town like this, superstition is just another word for survival. You don't notice the bells at first. They're soft, just a gentle, resonant thrum that blends with the bleating of sheep and the clatter of wooden wheels on cobblestone. But then you realise the sun hasn't even set, and already the townsfolk are packing up. Shopkeepers shutter their stalls. Women pull children indoors. A boy races past, shouting, "Curfew bells ringing!" Curfew? It's not even dark yet. You follow the sound to the centre of the village where a crooked iron bell swings lazily in a timber frame. A wrinkled man with shoulders like fence posts pulls the rope with practised rhythm, his expression unreadable. He nods to you once and continues ringing. You're not the only one confused. A traveller, judging by her long cloak and dusty boots, tries to buy bread from a baker just closing his shop. He refuses. "Curfew," he says, pointing to the bell as if it answers all questions. You ask an older woman what the rush is. She eyes you warily and says, "If your fire's not banked by sunset, your house is the next to burn." There's no further explanation, so you press for more. Eventually, over a tankard of ale at the Widow Run Tavern, remember the alewives, someone explains. The curfew bell comes from the old French couvre-feu, literally cover fire. It's not about bedtime, it's about not letting your thatch-roofed house become a torch. In a world without street lamps, fire departments or fire retardant anything, open flames were everywhere, cooking, lighting, heating. And those fires, they didn't just burn wood, they burned families, entire neighbourhoods. Every evening the bell was rung to signal everyone in town to douse, cover or bank their hearth fires. Smother the flame, close the flue, pour water on coals. It wasn't negotiable. One unattended ember could jump to a rafter, then to the neighbour's roof, and by dawn your whole town would be ashes and bones. You think of modern fire codes, smoke alarms, sprinklers. None of that existed. What they had was a bell, and fear. Some towns even had patrolmen who'd knock on doors checking for glowing embers or suspicious chimney smoke. If you broke curfew and your fire caused damage, punishment could be brutal. Fines, public shaming, or exile. In some cities, firebreak laws mandated how far apart homes had to be or which materials could be used. But this town, no exceptions. The bell rings, the fires die. And yet, as always, superstition sneaks in. One villager leans in conspiratorially and whispers that the bell's tone, deep and mournful, was designed to keep spirits away. According to local belief, fire attracts restless souls. The curfew bell not only prevents burning homes, it quiets wandering ones. You glance at the bell again. It swings more slowly now. Its song echoes through the alleyways like a warning from another world. You suddenly remember a detail from your own history classes. In Norman England, King William the Fast made curfew bells mandatory in towns across the realm. It was a public safety measure, yes, but also a way to instill uniform discipline. Sound the bell, end the noise, end the chaos. Order enforced by sound. So when the final toll fades and silence falls across the village, you realise this isn't bedtime, it's protection. By the time you wander back to your lodgings, the village has gone still. Eerily still. No footsteps, no laughter, not even the clink of a mug. Only the occasional creak of wood settling under its own weight. Even the dogs seem to have taken the hint. Inside the cottage, your host, a stout, sleepy-eyed woman who introduced herself only as Auntie, is carefully sliding a heavy iron lid over the hearth. You offer to help, but she waves you off. "Don't want the chimney drawing," she mutters, tapping the bricks with the side of a soot-blackened poker. "Last time someone left the coals open, we lost half the north row. Poor little Elmira never got out of the hayloft." You pause. "Wasn't that decades ago?" Auntie shrugs. "Fire doesn't keep calendars." That night, you lie on a straw mattress in the cold and marvel at the logic of it all. In a world lit entirely by flame, every person was a potential arsonist, by accident. A dropped taper, a gust of wind, an overfed hearth, and entire families could vanish before the rooster crowed. And yet, it wasn't just fear that kept the curfew bell alive. Over the generations, it had taken on a rhythm, a comfort. Children were raised by its chime. Couples timed their dinners by it. The last song in the tavern was always cut off mid-verse as the bell began. It gave the night a spine. What had begun as a harsh command had softened into ritual. Still, even rituals have teeth. You wake in the middle of the night to shouting in the distance. A red glow pulses faintly beyond the shuttered window. Auntie is already up, clutching a jug of water in one hand, a wool blanket in the other. "Smithy's boy left the forge hot again," she mutters, shoving boots on her feet. Fool child. That bell didn't ring for his amusement. You follow her to the door. Outside, villagers sprint in all directions, forming a bucket line. You watch as steam hisses off stone and shouts rise through the dark. And then, it's over. The fire is caught, contained. The village exhales. By dawn, the bell hangs still and soot-streaked faces gather near it, not to punish the boy, but to remind him. An elder speaks a few solemn words about loss, responsibility, and the cost of forgetting. The boy's face burns brighter than the flames ever did. You realise then, the bell isn't just metal and noise, it's memory. A warning passed down like bread or songs. Something forged from fire and fear and love for the living. Later, as you step through the quiet lanes, the day begins again. Stalls open. Doors creak. Fires are carefully, cautiously lit. Life continues, under the watchful shadow of a bell no one dares ignore. And when twilight comes again, you already know what's coming. You'll hear that low, mournful toll drift through the mist and feel a little safer. Not because it's bedtime, because it's protection. The next day, you wander into the village bakery, lured by the scent of something warm, yeasty and slightly burnt, like a sourdough that's had a rough morning. Inside, the baker is pulling loaves from a stone oven, with the kind of reverence normally reserved for newborns or relics. You're hungry, famished really. And when you point to the warmest, freshest-looking loaf on the rack, the baker gives you a look like you just kicked his dog. "That one's for tomorrow," he says flatly. You blink. "But it's just come out." He sighs like he's said this 1,000 times and still can't believe people keep forgetting. "It has to sit," he mutters, placing the steaming loaf high on a shelf. "Can't eat bread the same day it's baked. That's how accidents happen." You glance around, half expecting to see signs warning about fresh bread hazards. Instead, you see shelf after shelf of yesterday's loaves, firm, slightly misshapen, their crusts as solid as roofing tiles. You pick one up. It's hard. Really hard. You could build a wall with these things. The baker sees your face and chuckles. "Oh, that's the good stuff. Proper trencher bread. He explains, in this town and many like it, bread wasn't just food, it was plate, spoon, sponge, napkin, and finally, pig feed. These thick, day-old slices, called trenchers, were the medieval equivalent of dinnerware. You piled stew on them, used them to sop up gravy, and at the end of the meal, handed the soggy remains to the poor, or pigs, or both. The harder the bread, the better it held up. Soft bread. That was wasteful, messy, suspicious. You ask him if people ever bake soft, fluffy loaves just for eating. He winces. Only the French do that, he says, and look where it got them. You laugh, but the message is clear. In this part of the world, softness equals softness, and softness, in hard times, is a liability. There's something else too, something darker. The baker lowers his voice and tells you a story from his father's time. Once, a nobleman visiting from the city requested fresh bread, demanded it. The town's bakers obliged, baking through the night, presenting warm loaves at dawn. The nobleman took one bite and collapsed. Poison. But not because someone laced the bread. No, it was the flour. Poorly aged. The humidity of the baking chamber had reactivated spores. Ergot, they whispered. The same fungus that made peasants hallucinate and vomit, that turned bread into madness. It thrived in moist, improperly stored rye, and the fresher the bread, the more dangerous it could be. So the town made a rule: no bread eaten on the day it's baked. Not just tradition, survival. You glance back at the steaming loaf on the shelf. Still warm, still off limits. You suddenly want it less. It's strange, isn't it? In your own time, nothing's more luxurious than warm, crusty bread. But here, the luxury is in waiting, in letting it go cold and hard so it can be safely soaked, sliced, and survived. By the time you leave the bakery, you carry a loaf so dense it could double as a weapon. It smells faintly of ashen barley, and strangely, you trust it more. You carry your dense, day-old loaf through the village like it's a family heirloom. Awkward, slightly unwieldy, and absolutely necessary. You stop at a wooden bench near the square, tear off a corner with effort that makes your knuckles ache, and gnaw thoughtfully. It's chewy. Not bad, just stubborn, like it wants you to prove you're worthy of the carbs. Across the square, a group of children are playing some sort of game involving sticks, stones, and surprisingly elaborate insults. One of them whips a stale crust at another. It bounces harmlessly off his shoulder and lands with a hollow thud. The victim picks it up and starts chewing on it anyway. You're starting to get it now. The bread isn't meant to delight, it's meant to last, and it's meant to be shared. A travelling friar sits beside you and pulls a similar brickloaf from his satchel. He nods at yours approvingly. Good crumb, he says, tapping it like a melon. Where'd you get it? You point to the bakery. Ah, old Bartel, he says. Knows what he's doing. Didn't give you any of that same-day heresy, did he? You raise an eyebrow. He's joking. Probably. But then the friar leans in and tells you something that makes your stomach twist. In the years of poor harvests, some bakers cheated. They added chalk, sawdust, even powdered bones to stretch their flour. The worst of it, you couldn't always taste the difference until you started coughing blood. That's why some towns, like this one, required every baker to follow the assize of bread, a medieval regulation that dated back to the 13th century. It controlled not just the price of bread, but its weight, size, and contents. Bakers who violated it could be fined, pilloried, or forced to eat their own faulty wares. You suddenly look at your loaf with new respect. This thing has been measured, tested, watched. It's a product of survival, engineered not for comfort, but for consistency. If there's anything medieval people feared more than a famine, it was a dishonest baker. The friar tears his loaf in half and offers you a piece of salted lard to smear on yours. It's not a feast, but it feels deeply human. Rough bread, greasy fat, and a silence between strangers that somehow tastes like trust. Later that evening, as you sit near the hearth in the tavern, you notice something strange. No one eats bread right away. Stews come out, roasted roots, even pickled eggs. But the bread, it sits, it waits. People tear off chunks only when the main meal is nearly done, using it like a spoon, a napkin, or a final course. And when they're done, they don't toss it. Some feed the rest to their dogs, others collect it in a basket for beggars. One old man slips his into his pocket with the care of someone saving a charm. In this world, nothing goes to waste, not even a dry crust. So you bite down again, jaw aching, but heart full. The bread might be stale, but the rule behind it, fresh as ever. You've barely digested your brickloaf breakfast when another rule finds you, this time in the form of your own socks. You're admiring a pair of bright blue and mustard-striped hose hanging from a stall near the edge of the marketplace. They're oddly cheerful in a town that otherwise seems committed to a palette of mud and moss. You reach out, fingertips grazing the coarse wool, when the stallkeeper snaps his hand over yours like a mousetrap. "Not for you," he hisses. You blink. "I was just looking." He glances around nervously. "Look with your eyes, not your station." You frown. Station. You're not sure whether to be offended or flattered. Then a loud voice cuts through the tension. A man in an absurdly tall hat, wearing hose the colour of pickled beetroot. He strolls past as if he owns the street. The vendor bows slightly. "Now we can wear stripes," the stallkeeper mutters. "Landed gentry." It clicks. You've stumbled into the strange, colourful world of sumptuary laws. Rules that dictated exactly what you were allowed to wear based on your class, income, or social position. Want to wear silk? Not unless you're nobility. Want red dye? Better have a title. Want stripes on your socks? Only if you've got enough land to justify the flair. You laugh, quietly. The idea of government-regulated fashion seems like a medieval satire until you realise the purpose: visual control. In a time when reading was rare and social mobility was dangerous, clothes did the talking. Who you were needed to be obvious from 50 paces. If a peasant dressed like a noble, he could demand better treatment, cheat in court, or, God forbid, flirt above his level. So the laws were strict, and oddly specific. In 1363, for instance, an English statute forbade servants from wearing cloth worth more than 2 shillings a yard. Only knights could wear velvet. Only earls could wear imported furs. And hose, those bold, colourful leg coverings, were regulated right down to their width and colour. The result? A walking caste system, enforced by your own wardrobe. You glance down at your travel-worn boots and plain brown tunic. You look peasant-adjacent, which in this town probably keeps you safe. But you can't help but be intrigued. Why striped socks? A grizzled woman sweeping the tavern steps offers you a theory. "Stripes draw the eye," she says. "They say, 'Look at me.'" Not something a stable boy needs, you nod. In fact, in some regions, stripes were once associated with criminals and outcasts, visually disruptive, hard to track, suspicious. But as fashion evolved, so did meaning. The wealthy started to own stripes, not just on socks, but sleeves, doublets, even hats. Of course, if a poor man copied that style, fines, stocks, in extreme cases, confiscation of property, over socks. The stallkeeper, now mollified, lets you handle a pair of dull grey hose. Safe, he says, unoffensive. They feel like cold porridge and look worse, but you get it now. In this world, even your ankles can commit treason. Later that afternoon, you spot a young boy racing through the square with striped hose bunched up around his ankles, laughing as he darts between wagons. He's caught moments later by a sharp-nosed woman who seizes him by the ear and scolds him in hushed fury. The hose! Snatched off his legs and bundled up tight like contraband. It's not just fashion, it's contraband. And suddenly you see it everywhere. A merchant with an extra deep collar quickly flips it inward as a knight passes. A woman on her way to church tugs a veil further down her shoulders. Fine silk, a little too shiny for someone without a title. Even children are dressed with caution. No garish dyes, no elaborate stitching. All plain and brown like walking loaves of rye. You stop by a small tailor's shop tucked between a tannery and a fishmonger's stall. Inside, the air smells of lye and lavender. Bolts of fabric are stacked in neat piles labelled in looping script. For clergy, for commoners, for knights' wives only. You ask the tailor, an elderly man with ink-stained fingers, how he keeps track of who's allowed to wear what. He doesn't look up. I keep a copy of the register, he says simply. The law lists who may wear silk, who may wear sable, and who must wear sackcloth. I make no mistakes. I like my ears where they are. It sounds absurd, until he shows you a well-worn ledger, bound in cracked leather, filled with line after line of textile codes and fines. He points to one note. A merchant's daughter wore ermine cuffs in the presence of the bishop's sister. Public flogging, 2 shillings fine. You blink. For cuffs? He nods. She bled on the fur. It was very dramatic. You realise then that these laws weren't just about control. They were about drama, envy, jealousy, public theatre, everyone watching everyone else ready to pounce at the first sign of upward fashion fraud. And beneath it all, a quiet truth hums. In a rigid society, clothing is revolution. One wrong hem, one too fancy button, and suddenly you're not knowing your place. You're pretending, and pretending, especially in public, was dangerous. Back outside, a scribe in ink-streaked robes gives you a knowing look as you pass. The king's tailor wears wool and linen, he mutters, but the king's mistress wears French lace. Tell me who has the power. You think of the striped socks again. So cheerful, so petty, so powerful. That night at the tavern you see a young woman quietly darning a pair of bright green hose beneath the table. When she notices you watching, she doesn't hide it. She just winks. Just for the woods, she whispers. Where the sheriff can't see. You grin. Because even in a world of rules, some people still dare to wear colour where they're not supposed to. And in the quiet rebellion of socks, there's something timeless. It's a fine morning when love gets complicated. Not because of who you love, but when. You're seated on a stone bench outside the village chapel, watching as 2 nervous young sweethearts rehearse what looks like a very modest wedding. A borrowed ribbon, a wilted flower crown. He's fiddling with his tunic hem. She's clutching a loaf of cheese like it's a bouquet. Everything seems ready. But then the priest arrives, robes fluttering like angry flags, and puts a swift stop to it. No weddings this week, he snaps, before storming off toward the rectory. The couple stands there stunned. A rooster crows awkwardly. You're as confused as they are, so you ask a passing midwife what just happened. Saints' days, she says, as if that explains everything. You give her a look. She sighs. You can't just get married whenever you fancy. Not during Lent. Not during Advent. Not on certain feast days. Not near Michaelmas, or Candlemas, or All Hallows' Eve. That's sacred time. No kissing, no singing, and definitely no I do. You blink. That's a lot of no. Turns out, in medieval Europe, marriage was tightly regulated by the church, not just in terms of how it happened, but when. The liturgical calendar, already stuffed with saints, fasts, vigils, and feast days, acted like a giant mood ring for your love life. Out of the 365 days in a year, nearly half were considered spiritually inappropriate for weddings. That included all of Lent, about 40 days, Advent, another 4 weeks, the 40 days after Easter, and several days surrounding major feasts. Why? Because marriage was joyous, celebratory. It involved music, dancing, feasting, wine, and bed sheets. And those things had no place during periods of religious solemnity. Weddings were seen as distractions, earthly indulgences that clashed with divine mourning or preparation. You sit with that for a moment. Love is fine, within reason, but timing is everything. A local miller's wife leans over from her vegetable stall and adds, "We waited 3 months to wed. Poor man nearly died of nerves. Wore a hole clean through his boots." You chuckle, but it's no joke. For many couples, forbidden wedding windows meant delays that risked pregnancies outside wedlock, or unions that lost their social momentum altogether. Some tried to sneak ceremonies through, bribing lesser priests or performing quiet hand-fasting ceremonies in barns and backfields. But if they were caught, the marriage could be annulled. Worse, fines, excommunication, or public penance. The church meant business. You recall a story from your own readings. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council ruled that weddings had to be announced in advance on 3 consecutive Sundays, called the banns, to prevent secret or hasty marriages. And still, even then, you had to make sure the calendar approved of your big day. It wasn't about love, it was about order. And saints came first. You catch up with the bride to almost be later that day. She's sitting by the well, veil discarded, ribbon unravelling, gnawing the corner of her cheese loaf like it wronged her. 3 more weeks, she mutters when you sit beside her. Until St. Swithin's Day is done, then maybe. You ask why they don't just do it anyway. A quiet ceremony, no fuss, she snorts. Try telling his mother that, or the priest, or my grandmother. She says if we wed during a black season, the cows will stop giving milk and my womb will dry up like salted cod. You weren't expecting that level of detail, but it's true. Aside from official church rules, folk beliefs and rural superstitions heavily influenced marriage timing. Some days were unlucky, some were cursed. Others were perfect, for blessings, fertility, prosperity, or just getting decent weather. Marrying on a Friday, bad luck. On a full moon, risky during harvest. Selfish, you take workers from the fields. On May Day, fertile but scandalous. Too fertile. And saints' days, that was a minefield. Each had their own mood. Some brought joy and abundance like St. Valentine or St. Agnes. Others were tied to martyrdom, bloodshed and heavenly wrath. Getting married on a martyr's feast day was like holding your honeymoon in a haunted house. The woman at the well flicks a beetle off her skirt. Anyway, she adds, the priest says St. Bartholomew was flayed alive, so it's not a good time to celebrate union. You try not to picture that during a wedding toast. In many towns, these beliefs had weight equal to canon law. Families tracked moon cycles, consulted almanacs, even hired local wise women to divine the luckiest dates. Marriage wasn't just legal or romantic, it was astrological, agricultural, mystical. The tavern keeper tells you a tale over dinner. Once, a couple tried to wed during Ember Days, a time of fasting and prayer. The bride broke into hives before the ceremony. The groom fell off a cart. The priest declared it a sign. They split. Coincidence? Maybe. But in a world where illness and misfortune struck without warning or explanation, people built rules to protect what little joy they had. Marriage was too important to leave to chance. So the lovers wait. They bake extra bread, stitch hems, practice steps. Maybe they'll wed at midsummer, under a saint with a cheerful reputation. Or maybe they'll elope to a fishing village where no one checks the calendar. You smile as you pass the chapel again. Someone's tied wildflowers to the door. It's not a wedding, but it's hope. Because even when rules bend time around love, people find ways to wait with grace. Or if necessary, they wed in secret under the stars. You're strolling through the village market, enjoying the afternoon sunlight, when you feel something sharp wedge itself between your toes. You look down, a turnip. A half-rotted one, to be specific, and slick with something unidentifiable. It wasn't thrown, just lying there, abandoned in the middle of the square. But it's enough to make you stumble, arms flailing, dignity scattered. You hear a chuckle from a nearby stall. Should have worn shoes, a voice calls, or at least paid the tax. No, you glance around, bewildered. Everyone else is barefoot too, except the man who spoke. He's in a stall behind a low wooden counter, his boots polished and smugly tied. You limp over to him. Is there some shoe ban I should know about, you ask? He doesn't answer right away, just points toward a stone slab near the edge of the square, weathered with time and stained by centuries. There's writing on it, but the carving's so shallow you can barely read it, until someone else whispers beside you, "By ducal decree no shoes shall be worn in the square on market day, so saith the turnip incident." That's not a joke. Not long ago, well, a few generations maybe, a duke from a neighbouring estate visited this very town to inspect the market. The story goes that he slipped on a greasy root vegetable, fell backward into a goose cart and broke 2 ribs and what little remained of his patience. Rather than blame poor road maintenance or the goose, he blamed footwear, specifically slick soles that gave no grip on the cobblestone. And because a duke's humiliation was never his fault, he issued a decree. On market days, all visitors and vendors must go barefoot in the central square, supposedly for traction. Realistically, out of spite. And here's the kicker. The law stuck. Over time, the original reason faded into myth, but the barefoot market rule endured. It was said to prevent slips, keep the stones cleaner, and, according to one enthusiastic tanner, strengthen the souls of peasants so they may better endure God's earth. You're sceptical, until you step back onto the stones. They're warm from the sun, worn smooth in the centre, but still rough around the edges. There's a rhythm to walking them barefoot, a strange intimacy between foot and stone. You feel every pebble, every dip, and somehow it works. Even the fishmonger agrees. You think I want to get herring guts on my good boots, he says, slapping a trout onto his stall. This way's better. Just don't stub your toe on the cheese cart. You pass a young girl skipping barefoot through puddles near the fountain. Her mother watches with amusement, basket on one hip, and says, "She won't need shoes till Easter. Her arches are better than mine already." Still, not everyone agrees. A visiting merchant, clearly not local, strides through the square in soft leather boots and draws more glares than a rooster at midnight. A boy chases after him with a ladle, tapping the man's shin and shouting, "Fine or no pie!" You don't know what that means, but it feels official. As the barefoot rule starts to sink in, literally thanks to the gravel near the pickle stand, you begin to see the logic behind it, or at least the peculiar kind of logic that medieval towns specialised in. Part superstition, part custom, part someone important once said so and no one dared undo it. You pass by a cobbler's workshop, expecting it to be empty on market day. But inside, the cobbler is busy, just not with shoes. He's sewing leather covers for carts, sharpening a tool and singing a tune about saints and splinters. When you ask him whether the barefoot law hurts business, he waves a dismissive hand. "Oh no," he says, "I make better coin on Mondays, when people come in with blisters." He gestures to a small pile of shoes tucked behind the counter. That's the market stash. Folks drop them off here before stepping onto the square. I polish, they buy turnips, everyone's happy. You glance down at your own scratched feet and wonder how many tetanus cases it would take for the town to reconsider. Then again, this town has weathered worse, and the barefoot rule, like so many others, has morphed over time. It's no longer just about a grumpy duke and a vegetable vendetta. It's become tradition, a kind of badge of belonging. Outsiders wear shoes, locals walk free. A farmer nearby tells you with pride, "My grandfather walked this market square every Thursday for 60 years, rain or shine, barefoot. Claimed he could tell the harvest would be good by how the stones felt in April." You're not sure whether that's folklore or foot trauma. Possibly both. Of course, not every town enforced their rules with such tactile enthusiasm. In some places, the barefoot tradition was linked to humility. Monks walked without shoes as an act of piety. Beggars walked barefoot to elicit charity. A shoeless merchant might signal poverty or penitence. But here, it's just about not falling on your backside because of a rogue root vegetable. That's the story everyone agrees on. Well, almost everyone. An elderly woman who sells cider from a barrel claims the true reason involves a curse, one placed by a wandering herbalist who slipped in the square and declared that all who trod in leather would carry the sin of her fall. Since then, anyone who wore shoes on a Thursday market was said to sprout warts shaped like cabbages. No one seems to believe her, but no one's risking it either. You walk a little slower after that, not because your feet hurt, they do, but because you're realising just how much these strange rules reveal about the people who live here. It's not just about control or punishment. It's about rhythm, ritual, a way of navigating the chaos of life with certainty, even if that certainty involves cold toes and turnip law. So when the sun begins to dip and the stalls pack up, you find your way back to the cobbler, retrieve your shoes, and slide them on with a sigh of deep personal victory. And in that moment you understand something. Sometimes putting your shoes back on feels like earning them. It's Sunday morning, and the village is humming, not with hymns or bells, but with the sharp twang of arrows slicing through air. You've barely stepped outside when a feathered shaft zips past your ear and thuds into a hay bale with alarming enthusiasm. A boy, no more than 10, cheers like he's won a joust. Behind him, an older man adjusts a longbow taller than he is and yells, "Keep your elbow up, or you'll gut your thumb!" You duck instinctively. Across the village green, dozens of townsfolk are lined up in neat rows, loosing arrows at painted targets. Some are in crisp formations, others wobble like drunken spiders. But they all have one thing in common. They're required to be there. Welcome to Mandatory Archery Sunday, a long-standing law in many medieval towns across England and parts of Europe. If you're a male of fighting age, you're expected to spend your Sunday afternoon practicing archery. Rain or shine. No excuses. You wander toward the edge of the green and are quickly handed a bow by a no-nonsense woman with forearms like tree trunks. "Shoot or get fined," she says, not unkindly. "We take attendance." You raise an eyebrow. "Fined?" She nods. "A penny if you miss practice. 2 if you miss 2 in a row. And if you miss a month? Let's just say you won't be enjoying stew and peace for a while." Turns out this isn't just village sport, it's national defence. Back in 1363, King Edward III issued a law requiring all able-bodied Englishmen to practice archery every Sunday. It wasn't a suggestion. England's military might depended on the legendary English longbow, and the only way to keep the population ready was to turn the bow into a weekly chore. The law even went so far as to ban other games, like football, tennis and dice, because they distracted men from their archery duties. In some towns, balls and gaming boards were confiscated and burned to keep focus on the fletching. Here in this village, the tradition never died. Even the children are involved. Toddlers fire toy arrows at stuffed targets. Teenagers compete for distance. Old men lean on walking sticks and yell advice. One particularly wrinkled fellow smirks at you and says, "I haven't hit a bullseye since Henry IV, but I still count." There's a festive air to it, strangely enough. Families gather. Bread is shared. Ale flows freely after the practice ends, and underneath it all a quiet understanding. When the time comes, they'll be ready. Because back then, war wasn't far away. Raids, skirmishes, civil unrest. They were always just a horizon away. Training every Sunday wasn't paranoia, it was policy. If your village was attacked, you didn't wait for nights. You were the army. And so the law persisted. Even centuries later, some places maintained it as local tradition, a sort of civic memory carved into muscle and string. You draw back your own bow awkwardly and release. The arrow sails, well, more like flutters, before planting itself in the grass a good 10 paces short. Someone claps anyway. "Better than the baker," a voice says behind you. You're not sure if that's a compliment, but you take it. Because in a world where survival depended on the string and stave, showing up with sore arms was better than staying home with soft hands. After your less than glorious archery debut, you retire to a shaded bench beneath an ash tree, where the village clerk is busy recording scores with an ink-stained thumb. He's got a wooden ledger open, and is frowning at a column labelled "Absentees." You lean in. They really keep track. He doesn't look up. Of course, it's the law. A village that forgets to aim soon forgets to defend. You can't help but admire the phrasing, both poetic and slightly terrifying. The clerk explains that in past centuries, particularly during the 100 Years' War, English victories were often credited to their longbowmen. Archers could fire 6 arrows per minute with deadly precision, raining volleys that broke cavalry charges and shredded infantry formations. The weapon turned farmers into soldiers, but only if they practiced, relentlessly. And so, archery practice wasn't just encouraged, it was woven into life. If you were old enough to draw a bow, you were old enough to be useful, by law. There were even local competitions, sanctioned mini-tournaments with prizes like cured meat, ale, or, in some generous villages, a goose. But beneath the cheering and wagers, there was always an